Welcome to Body of Light, Episode 8, featuring Lama Glenn Mullin. Lama Glenn Mullin is a Tibetologist, an author of many books, and teacher of Vajrayana Buddhism. So I got this interview set up through my dear brother Illuminati Congo, who I interviewed on episode 2 of this series. And Congo suggested that I talk to one of his teachers, who is Glenn Mullin. And I am so glad that it worked out because Lama is a vast ocean of knowledge and also experience on the subject of Tibetan Buddhism, Vajrayana Buddhism. He has great not just knowledge, but experience with different practices from different schools of Tibetan Buddhism, and also has been in the presence of having many different teachers. I think he says 25 or 30 different teachers from different schools of Tibetan Buddhism that he has intimately been with and studied with and has experienced firsthand their teachings and their energy. We go deep in this interview on the topic of rainbow body, around what's really happening when the body shrinks, dissolves into light, leaving hair, teeth, nails, and relics. I ask him if anyone on the spiritual path can attain rainbow body. Why do some and not others? And what is the path to rainbow body from the Tibetan culture, Tibetan forms of spirituality, and all the different forms of the Eastern Himalayan meditation enlightenment cultures? What is the path? What is the process that actually leads to a rainbow body type death experience? We also go into an interesting topic of, is the rainbow body specifically exclusive to Nyingma sect of Tibetan Buddhism? They kind of have Padmasambhava as their main influence, and many teachings, stories, tales say Padmasambhava was the first to bring the rainbow body type teachings of light body to earth, at least to that part of the world in the Himalayas. So that's a really fascinating thing that we talk about. And then I ask him a question related to my last interview, episode 7 with Lauren and Camille, about how towards the end of my interview with Lauren, he talks to me about how Vajrayana practices, a lot of them, especially more advanced ones, purposefully damage your relationship with yourself, your relationship with other people, food, the outer world, on purpose, so that you can give all your attention to what's going on within you and your subtle body, most subtle body, and energy bodies, and how that can be harmful. And he gave an example of someone, and how this can be harmful to people who are wanting to live still in this Western type of world, who have children or have goals and desires, or are artists or passions, or people running businesses, people doing things that are changing the world. Can you go into certain practices that were designed for meditation by meditation cultures in the East, practices that are designed to have the result, quote unquote, being rainbow body or full enlightenment? Can one practice these practices and still be engaged in the world and enjoy the world that we're in here in the West? So I touch on this with Glenn, asking him the question, what are the dangers and hazards of doing practices like Dzogchen practices, Mahamudra practices, or any type of forms of yoga, Tummo, and other things like this? So that was very interesting as well. So it was a deep, deep pleasure to speak with Lama Glenn. Every interview for me just kept getting better and better, and more fruit comes out of it, more aha moments. And it's like every moment, every interview was like really transforming my life in so many different ways. And I am so excited to share this really, I feel, groundbreaking interview. So please enjoy Lama Glen Mullin.
My greetings. My name is Glen Mullin, born in the east coast of Canada. But after college in my early 20s, moved to London to meet my mother's side of the family. She was a British war bride. After that, went to India to study with the Dalai Lama's people, the Tibetan refugees in India. And I studied there continuously for 12 years. And after the 12 years, started spending 6 months a year in the West, usually on traveling lecture tours or teaching tours related to my publishing or related to other Tibet-related activities. I think so this began in 1972, and by the early 90s, I had a dozen or so books in print, and generally during those years, I do a book a year. And eventually it's become something like 30 books in print in English, published in English, and a dozen or so of those have gone into numerous foreign languages. My main interest has always been the legacy of enlightenment, and you could say the extraordinary potential of the human mind, the mystical experience. My favorites probably include Rumi of the Sufi tradition, his poetry and his kind of general advice on how to posture the mind is a kind of the place from which and within which all experience arises. I love his poetry. Of course, the great Tao Te King of Lao Tse of China, a great classic in the nature of being, the nature of mind, the nature of the mystical endeavor. Within India, the Patanjali Yoga Sutras, I think it certainly interested me a lot from the point of view of kind of a structured approach to generating the Enlightenment experience. I think Rumi and Lao Tse tend to be more abstract, you could say, whereas Patanjali is more like an auto repair manual. And of course, the general theories of automotive engineering are very important, as we read in the Tao Te King of Lao Tzu and the Rumi's poetry. But the hands-on effect of the Indian tradition impressed me very deeply. My mom was a theosophist in her early years before marrying my dad and moving to Canada. Theosophy, that kind of universality of the Enlightenment experience or the mystical experience, was a key foundation of the theosophical movement. I would say the first Western movement to even acknowledge the relevance of anything other than the Judeo-Christian tradition. Before that, the idea was pretty well everyone else is just a bunch of savages waiting for the Brits, French, or Spanish to come and point out the European version of Christian way of looking at things. So Blavatsky and the Theosophists were probably the first Western movement to very strongly advocate openness to all traditions and relevance of all traditions. So in terms of my own training, though, I connected with the Tibetan mystics, especially the Dalai Lama. When I was in London and Europe, I heard the Dalai Lama was opening a school for Western people, train Western people. So I traveled to Dharamsala and met with him and was very much impressed, you could say. I really did feel kind of like coming home. And Tibetan Buddhism had the advantage, you could say, of coming into the modern era as the only ancient tradition that had been undamaged by European colonialization or colonialism. India, of course, had been taken over by the Middle Easters, should we say the Middle Easterners, and ruled by a foreign nation, firstly with the East Persians from, I don't know, roughly 1150 until the British came and replaced them with a different foreign government, the British Empire, British Raj. And so India certainly came, the Indian-based cultures came into the present world with, you could say, something of an inferiority complex due to having been conquered twice. And of course, very often inferiority complexes manifest as a overly aggressively superiority complex in response to compensate. The Chinese tradition had been very much uprooted and damaged by the communist wars and the communist takeover. So they were pretty well in turmoil, you could say. And the Islamic tradition certainly had suffered from colonialization, and the international oil criminal cartel. Muhammad was blessed by Allah with great oil resources. And so their tradition was somewhat, well, you could say, distorted by that impact of this colonialization. Some people don't know the fact that more Arabs died in World War I than Europeans, even though it was a European war, because the European nations had so many colonies in the Arabic world. And so the wonderful thing of the Tibetan tradition was it came into modern time in very strong, unadulterated, and crystal clear format. And when I arrived in Dharamsala in 1972, the Dalai Lama, his two great masters, Lingam Rinpoche and Trijang Rinpoche, and lamas from various schools of this mystical tradition, many of them managed to make it into exile. So it was possible to meet recognized qualified masters. Whereas I traveled around India and went to ashrams, but it's a little bit like the medical tradition in India. You could just sort of buy a degree and hang up a shingle, and you blinded 500 people before anyone notices that your eye operation license was just purchased. And that was always so the Tibetans had that advantage. And for that reason, after half a dozen years there, I felt it would be very good to start writing and translating. So I threw myself into the Tibetan language and put my efforts in that side of things. And I think one of my motivations or aspirations comes from a statement from the Dalai Lama in which he quotes a prophecy from the Buddha, which says 2,500 years after my passing, my Enlightenment tradition will spread to the West, the land of the red man, which Dalai Lama thinks refers to Europeans, because when Europeans and now Americans get angry, a little bit angry, they turn bright red. If they have a sip of whiskey, they turn bright red. If they walk quickly, they turn bright red. Although many people take it to mean also the North American native. In 2,500 years, my land will go to my Dharma, will go to the left, the land of the red man. And another coming from Kalachakra, which prophesies that at this time, if people of good heart and like mind all do their best, the world can come into an era of 1,000 years of a golden age. And if they don't, it could come into 1,000 years of darkness. And as a young adult, this made great sense to me, because when we look at the power of our media today and the power of the military, even though America boasts itself that there's, I don't know, 300 or 400 million guns amongst the ordinary populace, these are mostly little pea shooters, whereas the police and the army have tanks and satellites and planes. And so between the powers of the secret services and secret agencies and police states, we can see worldwide how it would be very, very easy to throw the world into 1,000 years of rule by the 2% and darkness for the 98%. A very concentrated light, you would say, amongst 2% and purely a materialistic, greed-driven light amongst those 2% and the other 90% essentially being oppressed. And the Dalai Lama statement, if we're to go in the direction of the light for 1,000 years, then all peoples must offer their best and leave out their worst, drop their worst. I think right now the dropping of the worst seems to be a big problem. And people always think that what they do is best and what everyone else does is second rate, but that has to be switched a little bit. So anyway, between books and traveling and teaching for 30 years and placing quite a few thousands of people in the practice of daily meditation and basically promoting the idea of if you control your own mind or understand the workings of your own mind, and through that understanding gain control over your own mind, you can gain control over your life. I try to make my own little contribution to the fulfillment of the prophecy of 1,000 years of a golden age.
Yeah. Thank you, Lama.
Mm-hmm.
So this documentary project started basically just from deep curiosity about the Tibetan rainbow body when I first started studying, researching it about 7 years ago, and then taking action on this project of deciding to make a film about it about 2 months ago. And I've done about 8 interviews so far. My main intention was to take this obscure, vast topic of the Tibetan rainbow body and really the like, what is it? Why is it? How is it? Questions were like my original fuel. And to find people like yourself, especially Westerners, who are deeply immersed in the Buddhist world and the Buddhist practice, and ask them these questions. I'd like to start there and just get your own opinion, knowledge on on the rainbow body. So there's the things that are the most curious to me is what we see as the observer of someone who has a rainbow body death occurrence, and then what's actually going on inside that person. So let's start with what we see. When someone has a rainbow body death occurrence, the body shrinks sometimes. Sometimes it
Mhm.
shrinks and leaves hair, nails, and teeth. Sometimes it shrinks and then dissolves into light, like Kempo Acho um, back in the late 1990s. What is that? Why is that happening? And what's going on there with that? Why does that happen?
Well, the Indo-Tibetan or the Himalayan tradition of Vajrayana Buddhism speaks of the nature of being as essentially being composed of kind of an energy side of things and a radiance side of things. In Tibetan, Lung Tang Sem, Vayu and Chitta in Sanskrit. And all physical phenomena basically just arise from this primordial form of energy. In the West, we tend to refer to it as prana, using the Sanskrit word prana, which is almost become an English word. We can find it in the Webster Dictionary and the Oxford Dictionary, borrowed from the Indian tradition. And this wind, air, energy in a very primordial state is equally balanced throughout the whole universe. And then the universe moves and worlds arise and human beings arise and so forth. And then we get an appearance of solid matter, an appearance of a mind within a body of solid matter. But Albert Einstein, who was very much influenced by Buddhist thinking and Indian thinking growing up, as he did in Central Europe, and the first Buddhist text translated into European languages, or carried into European languages, perhaps rather than translated, is a better word, by Schopenhauer, people like that. The idea of emptiness and somethingness as the two levels of reality. And this comes down to energy and mind, basically. And Albert Einstein referred to it as the optical illusion. Our bodies seem solid, but if we look at what is the body, it's made of cells. If we look at what is a cell, cell is made of molecules. And we look at what is a molecule is just spinning particles of energy or electricity, or let's say energy, for to use a word which perhaps goes together better with the Asian tradition. And we have this optical illusion of how things appear. And the nature of mind is such that we tend to live by the rules of the optical illusion more than we do by the rules of the beyond appearance nature. And therefore, the Buddhist word, very important word in the Buddha's Enlightenment teaching, is the word anatma. Rather than atma, what something is, a self, so to speak, both a self of one's own being, but also a self of one's finger, a self of the rock, the self of the tree, the self of the cloud. Rather than refer to it as the self of, Buddha referred to it as the non-self of. In other words, to try to look beyond the appearing nature and the way phenomena are conceptually digested by the perceptual apparatus. look beyond that to the real nature. And of course, this term invented by Albert Einstein, optical illusion, is very much inspired, you could say, by that Pan-Asian look, that Pan-Asian way of seeing things or language towards things. So then with our body, when we practice Tantric Vajrayana or Tantric Buddhism or the Tantric tradition, we say the body exists on 3 levels. This energy, which is the support of consciousness. Support, here is how we say, mind rides on energy like a rider on a horse. Depending what our energy is, mind rides that way. And the coarse level of the body serves as the horse supporting coarse consciousness. And the coarse level of the body are the 5 sense organs, the things we see, smell, taste, touch, hair. And of course, form here is not just my skandha of form, or my aggregate of form is not just this body, but it's everything I experience in the physical world in that way. In other words, everything I experience on that level becomes a kind of a peg on which I hang the hat of self. This is this and that is that. I'm like this and you're like that. These conceptual ideas arise. In other words, we identify ourselves, or we create a sense of self, and we create a sense of other by means of this conceptual process. And of course, the conceptual mind is a very small window on the vastness of being. It's a little bit like looking out through a telescope, and all you see is a small little piece of the sky. The conceptual mind has a very strong limitation in what it can perceive. As a young man, I grew up in the Church of England, the Anglican Church, because my mom was British, and I was born in Quebec, where you were either a Catholic or a Protestant, and a Protestant was mostly Church of England. And I remember when I was maybe 9 or 10 years old, a statement which really impressed me very much, that our ability to experience God is very much limited. And if the ordinary person with their ordinary conceptual consciousness were to get a glimpse, the energy could be so overwhelming that it would completely just incinerate the whole process of experience. In other words, conceptual grasping has to relax the smallness of the universe created by conceptual ideation, has to relax and become ever more subtle in order for the bigger picture of the universal force of goodness to be experienced. I was very impressed by that. It made a lot of sense to me. And then in the years to follow as a teenager, because my mom was a theosophist, she had Taoist books in the house and Sufi books in the house and so forth. Bhagavad Gita, the Tao Te King, the Rubaiyat of Omar Khayyam, the poetry of Kabir, Rumi, and so forth. This same sort of attitude we can see written in encapsulated in many of those writings. The vastness of being and the limits of the conceptual process. And of course, in the West, we have had very strong mystical traditions, but the a problem we've had in the West is that our mystical traditions very much became used as political instruments. I would really say for control of the masses. Sometimes we see it said from the time of Descartes, the kings of Europe owned your body and the church owned your mind. And so these two became divided properties, you could say. And this somewhat clouded somewhat hampered our mystical tradition and its potential for becoming an everyday, everyman experience. And basically, the king wasn't at all interested in everyone becoming mystics. He wanted them all to become loyal subjects, mostly to European wars and to working in such a way that the king and his family became wealthier and powerful, and everyone else, how wealthy or powerful they became wasn't that relevant to that way of seeing the world. If we look in the spiritual traditions of every different tradition around the world, we see references to this experience of the physical and the experience of the body and the outer world as experienced through the body. We see how it is referred to in many traditions as beyond appearance and not existing in the manner of its arising in the mind as an image in the mind of the experiencer and so on. We could say the idea of the rainbow body is based on this, that everything physical is just pure energy, like the right lights of a rainbow. And as long as we have the conceptual apparatus fixated on the illusory appearance of things, the illusory solidity, then that energy is kind of bound, you could say, within our perceptual process. And only through meditation, and we could say yoga in the bigger sense of yoga, meaning connecting to the authentic. Tibetans translate yoga as Naljor, connecting to the authentic, going beyond the illusory appearance to the beyond illusory appearance nature. This doctrine of rainbow body, as taught by Tibetans in every school of Tibetan Buddhism, and I think every school of Tibetan Buddhism sort of emphasizes their own way of discussing rainbow body, because Tibet was a huge country, larger than Western Europe, but with a very small population, and all those little valleys were their own independent little kingdoms. Sometimes we think Tibet was a country. It was really a federation of 300 or 400 countries that were bound by a sort of common commitment, you could say, to enlightenment, the mystical tradition as translated from Sanskrit into Tibetan. So every school of Tibetan Buddhism mentions the rainbow body as one of the processes of one of the side effects of the Enlightenment process, one of the side effects of the Enlightenment process. That essentially, as we practice the Vajra tradition, generate the Vajra body, or stabilize the inner Vajra body, as it's called, then the way energy works in our life transforms. It's much the same that example I heard by one of the Indian masters is with an elephant. If you have a very strong chain and you tie that elephant to the root of the trunk of a very, very strong tree, the elephant will pull on it, pull on it, pull on it, but can never really get away from it, from the tree. Its roaming ground is very limited to the 10 or 12 feet of the length of the chain. And eventually you can take the chain off and just replace it with a string. And even though the elephant could very easily break that string, it doesn't. It's used to just having that length of wandering territory. And the feel of the chain on its ankle has been replaced by the feel of this tiny little string, which it could snap at the smallest effort. In a way, our perceptual process in our relationship towards the body-mind complex tends to be like that. The conceptual image overrides the internal and external realities. So in the Indian tradition, the Buddhist Tantric tradition, you could say, from India, when we practice the Chandali Yoga, which Tibetans translate as Tumo, in the West gets mispronounced by the Hindus as Kundalini. Mispronounced, I say. But the Buddhists spell it as Chandali, Chandali Yogas. It's really talking about taking our whole experience of the universe and channeling, redirecting this flow of energy into the very core of our being and creating a little island within the center of our heart chakra, which is, you could say, something like a residence for consciousness. And the bigger picture of the world is sort of totally relaxed. The essence of all of that being has been extracted. A little bit like taking a sponge and sucking all of the essential nutrient out of it and putting it into a diamond hard little pellet right at the center of your heart chakra. And that practice in Tibetan Buddhism is known as gyula, which means something like illusory physicality. So taking the coarse and subtle and even most subtle levels of energy and centralizing them like this in that kind of a way. And when we do that, the manner in which the brain and the sense organs and so forth compartmentalize experience is broken down. And when we break down that compartmentalization, the mind is able to experience phenomena in a direct, non-conceptual way. And Buddha spoke about those as going through 8 coarse and 4 subtle levels, you could say, of illusory physicality, dissolving the chains binding the elephant to the tree of conceptuality, until you can give rise to primordial mother clear light mind on the basis of the most subtle energy collected at the heart. And when this is done, one basically, you could say, washes the illusory physicality of being in the radiance of primordial clear light mind. And so we see in Tantric literary expressions like again and again, dissolving the clouds of illusory physicality into the timeless radiance of original mind. The knots constricting our relationship with physicality are untied, and the rainbow body naturally arises or is experienced. So every highest yoga tantra, Maha-Anuttara Yoga Tantra in Sanskrit, Lama in Tibetan, speaks of that process. Tumo is the foundation, our entire sense of the physicality of being. It's a kind of a conventional level of reality that becomes misunderstood or distorted by the small prism of the conceptuality of being. And the potential of the human to generate the beyond physicality consciousness, beyond conceptuality consciousness, through yoga and meditation. And when that is the case, then one can untie the chains, creating the structures of coarse physicality, and can, as Einstein so eloquently puts it, penetrate the illusory, the optical illusion of coarse physicality. Now, one interesting point on this, I think, is if we look at ancient Indian mythology. I heard this statement said by a great Tibetan Bunpo master. Sometimes Bun is called the pre-Buddhist religions of Tibet, but they're not really pre-Buddhist. They're just really pre-7th century Tibetan Buddhism. In the 7th century, Tibetan king Songtsen Gampo unified all of Central Asia under his rule and created a common language for everyone. Before that, if you're on the West, you use the Arabic script. If you're on the East, you'd use one of the Chinese or Tengut scripts. If you're on the North, you'd use Khotanese. If you're on the South, you'd use one of the 6 forms of Sanskrit. And so they had no unified script. And in the 7th century, Songtsen Gampo united the 400 kingdoms of Central Asia and wanted a common language for everyone, so created a script based on Indian Sanskrit. And then everyone had to use that script. The use of other scripts became gradually banned. So from within 100 years, use of Chinese or Arabic within Tibet, Khotanese, and so forth were all banned, other than as decorative or private decorative scripts. In other words, kind of as pieces of art or for personal correspondence. And so all of those Buddhist traditions that had come in from China, from the East, and of course, in those early days, all of the East Persian Empire was Buddhist. You know, it went right up through Pakistan, through Taxila, through Bamiyan in Afghanistan, and over to Khotan on the north. So the Buddhist tradition of East Persia was perhaps one of the most bright, radiant forms of Buddhism in the evolution of the Enlightenment tradition as it traveled from central India to various places. And the Bampo master pointed out in ancient India, there was this idea, so Bampo not really being a pre-Buddhist form, although the term is sometimes used for everything non-Buddhist, which was around Tibet from early days. So here he points out that in India, there's this idea that the original humans come to Earth as Akanista Deva, Ogmengila in Tibetan. And this is kind of an ancient Indian myth that humans aren't evolved from the apes on planet Earth as Darwin would have it, but rather life on Earth was teeming with various species. And let's say perhaps they did originate in the way Darwin described, somewhat in the way Darwin described. And then some Akanista Devas landed on planet Earth. And according to the legend, they traveled by the power of light and the power of mind. Ships of light, ships of mental samadhi. But on planet Earth, they ate some things that made their bodies a little heavy. And they couldn't take off. And so originally, the original nature of an Akanista Deva is that the body is a rainbow body. This is the natural quality of an Askadeva, corpus, let's say, corpus Akanistadeva. And the human urge to reclaim that rainbow quality of physicality is there as a very deep, primordial instinct or drive within, we could say, sensitive humans. I have to say sensitive because it really means humans able to listen to their own inner drives rather than just be thrown this way and that, dragged this way and that by the wild horses of the senses. When I heard that, that made a lot of sense to me in terms of if we look at humans and animals and how different they are. Of course, we share a lot of the same traditions, a lot of the same DNA, you could say. And of course, my way of thinking, with the Akanista Devas arrived here, according to the theory, the ones who arrived here were all male, no females. And I don't know if you've ever been lost on a desert island, but if there's a lady monkey or a lady ape, that lady monkey or ape starts looking ever less hairy and ever more attractive. The first month or two, it's like, oh, not quite my standards.
That brings me to my next question, Lama. And you're saying how this, what I'm hearing you say is that this rainbow body, this light body, this dissolving into light is something that we are, something that we all have within us. It's in all things. It could be our natural, true state of being. Do you feel that it's possible for people in the West who are sensitive, engaged in a spiritual path, but are engaged in also Western affairs, maybe householders, parents, laborers, people living in cities, etc.? Can we live, embody this same level of enlightenment that these beings who do have rainbow body experiences? Because I noticed from my research, most of the documented cases of rainbow body and even other light body traditions from around the world, it happens to, again, the documented ones, the cases, it happens to the people who are very extreme practitioners, very extreme. They're either monks, nuns, or ascetics who are very dedicated to a practice. So do you feel it is possible for us living in the West to embody the same qualities that these masters have? For example, the love, the compassion, the joy, the service that those beings who do have rainbow body or light body, that those beings embody? Can Westerners reach the same level of being in state of enlightenment, for lack of a better word?
There's no question in my mind that there's no racist element in the Enlightenment tradition. I mean, Buddha was born on the borders of Nepal and India. Often we say Buddha was an Indian, but he was really born in Nepal, and his mom and dad were both Nepalis. But they were just a few hundred miles south of Tibet. It was often Buddha said that Buddha had a golden moon-like face, which is sort of the Mongolian stock of Tibet, Mongolia, like that. And his mother was very, very sort of white complexion. The father a dark complexion. And the Dharma starts there and spreads around India, travels up first through Pakistan, what is today Pakistan, the East Persian Empire, all the way to Herat and Bamiyan. Of course, we know of the Buddhism in Afghanistan because of the Taliban getting angry at the West for boycotting them for not letting girls go to school. And they said, if you keep boycotting us, we're going to blow up those Buddha statues because you guys like art. And to us, it's just art. And to punish you, or you have to stop boycotting us, or we'll use those for target practice. So we know the strength of the Enlightenment tradition there. And of course, it traveled across the Silk Road and went to Mongolia, down into China, over to Korea, Japan. As I like to say in partial jest, if all of those dummies can accomplish enlightenment, why not us? There is nothing, and Buddha himself said, anyone, any race, any age, any gender can accomplish enlightenment. And to accomplish enlightenment, you need three things. Tupa, you need to receive the instructions. Sampa, you need to think through them carefully and get them very clear in your mind. And Gampa, you have to do in some kind of intensive meditation practice. And if we look at the Indian tradition of who accomplished enlightenment, the Mahasiddha Tsumbupa. Tsumbupa means tailor. He was a tailor, and by sewing, he noticed how when you put two things together, their duality disappears and becomes a unity. And in the same way, when we notice the threads connecting all things in the universe, we notice the interconnectedness of all things. And when we notice the interconnectedness of all things, we notice that nothing has an inherent duality or separate nature. So just as a tailor, he achieved enlightenment. And Tilbupa, of course, Til in India, in the Indian language, means sesame. So his name is Mr. Sesame. And by pounding sesame seeds and making oil, his guru gave him that practice, and as kind of a meditation practice, and sort of like Mr. Mariaki, wax on, wax off. And Mariaki is Japanese, and the boy training under him is a little Californian, like you could say spoiled brat. By waxing on and waxing off, eventually he gets it and becomes quite good at the karate tradition. So in this way, Tilopa, by pounding sesame seeds and making oil, comes to understand that the oil, the precious oil of the essence of being, permeates all phenomena. And when we can penetrate to that realization on a beyond conceptuality, non-conceptual level, but let's say beyond conceptuality level, then the enlightenment experience arises. And of course, Tilopa, the Chakra Samvara Tantra coming through, Tilopa very much describes the process for conscious yoga for accomplishing the rainbow body. It's just part and parcel. You could say it's a side effect. Now, of course, Nyingma Lamas, both in Bonn and in the Dzogchen Lamas, both in Bonn and in Nyingma school, sort of think that they've got a kind of a special claim to the Vajra body and the rainbow body, but no, not at all. In fact, they have no lineages coming from Tilopa, because Tilopa is after Padmasambhava, centuries after, so it's no connection whatsoever. And the rainbow body is clearly taught by Buddha in all highest yoga tantras, Yamataka, Chakrasambhara, Kala Chakra, Guhya Samaja, Hayagriva, and so forth. And all Tibetan schools hold equally and cherish and practice equally those highest yoga tantras. So, if it can travel from India to Tibet, and it can work for Tibetans, it can travel to China, it can work in China, travel to Mongolia, work with Mongols, to Korea, work with Koreans. Well, why wouldn't it work for everyone else? And we are included among that category of everyone else. So there's no question that anyone can engage in Tantra. I think Tantra is more universal for people to engage in than, say, Buddha's Sutrayana teaching, which doesn't discuss Vajrabhati, doesn't go into this esoteric side of the Enlightenment experience. Tibetans, one term for those general open teachings of the Buddha is Sogche, public teachings, because they're just based on ordinary parents of things, Four Noble Truths, 12 links of dependent origination, suffering the cause, liberation the path, the stages of shamatha and vipassana for penetrating, bringing the mind quiet and penetrating to deep samadhi and so forth. So the rainbow body isn't discussed in those Sogche, public teachings of the Buddha. They're really exclusive to highest yoga tantra. And if we looked at who accomplished highest yoga tantra, there's not that many monks or nuns in the lineage who accomplished great states in India. In Tibet, of course, because they had vast territories, but very sparse resources, both in vegetables and in animals to eat, herders and farmers, where a lot of people became monks or nuns as a kind of a national birth control policy on the part of the king. The king accomplished that by having one of your kids become a monk or a nun as a form of tax. And so it was that was it. It's like only two things in life are certain, death and taxes, as Mark Twain put it. So if you're given the tax of one of your kids becoming a monk or a nun, then one of your kids becomes a monk or nun, and that's that. And we can't say that they were all especially spiritual by inclination, but by training, they become more spiritual. And I think, so in Tibet, we see more monks and nuns and lay people in practice, not because of that being a better format for spiritual training, but because of the monk tax. Yeah. And, if we look at every school of Tibetan Buddhism was formed by a non-monk. Nyingmas were formed by, although there's hundreds of people who contributed to the formation, they kind of elect Padmasambhava as their mascot or their symbol, if you will. And the Sakya school by Koncho Gyalpo, I think is his name, and by Drapa Gyaltsen and Kunga Nyingpo, all non-monk practitioners. The Kadampa or Gelugpa formed by Lama Drum Dumpa, a lay disciple of Atisha, Kargyu by Marpa Milarepa. So with my students, if any of them ever asked about becoming a monk, I always tell them it's got nothing to do with spirituality as such. That basically it's a lifestyle option. And if the opposite sex drives you bananas, you prefer not to get involved in all of the arguments over who washes the dishes, takes out the garbage, and so forth. then it's okay, good to become a monk or nun. Buddha himself said, if the lifestyle agrees with you, being a monk or nun is a happy profession. If you don't like the discipline, it's a form of torture. And we see that with monks and nuns all over the world, isn't it? If you take vows of celibacy and you're as like horny as a goat in springtime, then it makes a problem for you and it makes a problem from the community you're in and so forth. And it's it's just universal. It's not like this is unique to Catholics or something like that. It's if you're very randy by a person with a super strong sex drive and you don't have a clue how to ride that energy in a creative way without becoming bound by it, it just becomes an obsessive compulsive disorder.
It seems like rainbow body is a byproduct of how one lives, how one practices, especially, there's the Dzogchen system and all these other traditions that kind of have that as an end goal, you can say.
Yeah, I don't think anyone has rainbow body as such as a goal.
No?
No, I don't think so. The people have as a goal accomplishing what's called the 5 stages of Tantra by Nagarjuna, the great Indian master. The generation stage, when you can train your mind to see your body as pure energy. And you therefore, like we see paintings of mandalas with bright rainbow colors, and the world of physicality is pure energy. And you train your mind by means of the power of samadhi, controlling the conceptual process. That's called Keirim in Tibetan, the generation stage practice, which is basically you connect first to your most inner silence, inner formlessness, and taking clear light mind as Dhammakaya, Buddha mind. And then you connect to how you come out of this as a sort of a first movement, as this radiant, joyful sense of self. And that's known as taking the bardo, or the in-between, as the bliss body of the Buddha. And then you come out of that as taking rebirth as Nirmanakaya. In other words, how to take your bliss body into the dentist when you go for a root canal, or your dad's a drunk and he comes home and beats your mom and beats you up, or you live in abject poverty on the outskirts of a ghetto. How do you bring the bliss body into those? Or, you're in the Ukraine when NATO decides they want Ukrainian gas and oil, and they want to break up Russia into little pieces so they can get access to Russia's oil and mineral resources. And so NATO decides to make a war in Ukraine as a way to rob Ukraine and the Russian Republic, the 19 Russian republics, as the new frontier for robbing resources from the planet. And how to be in Ukraine when that comes along. And NATO says, yes, we're going to rob. And Putin says, nope. And you're caught in between these two super military forces, both of whom have probably 50% of their economies tied up in the military machine, and therefore both of whom benefit. The nice thing, too, is you can get rid of some people you don't like in those kind of encounters by putting them on the front lines. The story of Richard III in Shakespeare comes just because of that. But yeah, how to take your primordial radiance and your primordial joyful radiant nature and bring that into the humdrum of everyday life, into all the dark corners of everyday life. So the first stage Tantra is like that, and accomplished by means of samadhi, basically by means of a meditative power. and the second stage, which is the Tumo, illusory physicality and natural radiance. And when we can do that, we come to the fifth stage, which is Yuganada, the great union of mind and radiance. We could say the illusory rainbow body is like a natural byproduct of that.
Yeah. Do you feel it is safe for Westerners to imply different different intense spiritual practices like Dzogchen, for an example, or other Vajrayana practices that come from different meditation traditions? Do you feel it is safe for a Westerner to imply them onto their life um, as living as
Mm-hmm.
Westerners do? Like, were there any
Well, I
dangers?
think whatever anyone does, there's always some danger involved.
Sure.
One of my favorite American comedians is Bill Burr, the Bostonian Irish redhead. And he said, if you put a swimming pool in your backyard, your chances of someone dying of drowning in your backyard increase. And, whatever we do, there will be some people who do it badly. There's no question. That's always going to be there. We learn to drive. And now in America, between 40 and 50,000 people a year kill themselves by driving. It's essentially just meant as a convenience of getting here to there, making life easier and simple. And suddenly, in 1 year, we kill off as many Americans as died in the entire as many Americans as died in the entire Vietnam War, about which America is still whinging and whining. And whatever you do, some people will do it badly and may have some bad effects. But once when I was teaching in Chicago, I taught there every year for maybe 30 years, at least once a year on my US teaching tours. And someone put up their hand and said, oh, Lama Glenn, is Tibetan Tumo Kundalini dangerous? And I pointed out that every year, billions of dollars of damage are caused to Americans by tripping over their pets and falling downstairs, broken bones, broken hips. Thousands of people die from the results of those injuries. So I said, if you want to live safely, buy a gun, go home and shoot your pets. Whereas if you, anything you do, from owning a pet to having a swimming pool, can go wrong if people don't do it correctly. But if we do something correctly, there's no danger.
What would be that correct?
I mean, obvious. So correctly really here means you receive the instruction from a qualified teacher. You understand those methods correctly. And you practice with mindfulness and self-awareness, and with Tibetans call it Trempa Tangshen or Trinche, mindfulness and sort of honest self-analysis or self-observation. But still, you have some people going a little wonky either way. There's nothing to say or do about that. But traditionally we hear it said that if your refuge is strong, put a Dharma Sangha. In other words, you have a daily, 3 times during the day and 3 times during darkness, you invoke the idea of Buddha mind, your own inner clarity, Buddha mind. And you invoke awareness of Dharma, which is whatever instruction you received. And you invoke awareness of Sangha, accomplished practitioners. Then there's really, any danger is really minimalized and really not at all a big deal. But of course, you will have people who have, half-baked gurus or lamas, so they don't receive correct instruction from a qualified teacher. Probably half the Tibetan teachers teaching around the West are in that category of being unqualified. I mean, they get put into a monastery or training program as an infancy, and then they're just put on that as kind of a career path, and they're not really that accomplished. And then, in certain schools of Tibetan Buddhism, like a lot of these are father and son. I mean, there's some lamas who appoint, 4 of their 6 children to give them the title of reincarnate lamas and send them out teaching Dharma around the world, regardless of how accomplished they are. But, most of those don't really teach high tantra. They mostly teach refuge bodhicitta. And so Chen is it's just a very simple emptiness method. It's nothing. It's called the highest teaching of Buddha in the Nyingmas and Bonpos because it uses less paraphernalia, you could say, as support. So it's a subtle teaching or an abstract teaching. But as a basis of all Nyingma Bonpo practice, there's nothing especially high about it. Some Lama just points out how to keep your mind in Rigpa, in other words, to create a kind of an island of experience within yourself, something a little bit more authentic than just hopping around from this object of the senses to that object of the senses. There's a platform of experience. And on that basis, you engage in whatever trainings your particular teacher recommends. So every Buddhist tradition, so this in Tibetan is called Tawa, the way of watching, or the way of the witness, perhaps, because Tawa literally means seeing or watching. And Nyingmas and Bonpos use the language of East Persia when Buddhism cross-fertilized with the early Persian mysticism of, the Sufism and the sun people, Zoroastria and so on, the crystal and the light, this idea of how a kaleidoscope can make a whole world appear when a little beam of light goes through it, and suddenly there's a whole display. And everything is a little bit like that in our mind. So it's a way of looking. That word is not used in any of the new schools. It was never used in India, only in the East Persian Empire, the Buddhist Empire, after Indian traditions cross-fertilized with Persian traditions. And India therefore uses the term Mahamudra. And so all the new schools, the Kargyupas and Sakyapas and Shichepas and Ralupas and Shalupas and Gulukpas all use the word Mahamudra, not Dzogchen. It's not part of that Indian Sanskrit tradition. Of course, we can create an Indian Sanskrit term for it by retranslation or refabrication, but it's not there in the Magadha tradition, you could say, the north central Indian tradition of Tantra, not in the early Bengal or Orissa, those areas from which Buddhist Tantras first emerge and travel through Central Asia. And so, and the other terms like Madhyamaka or Uma, how to sit in the center silently between the vast display of everything in the universe, in the physical world, and on the other hand, the just pure radiance within which all of that manifests. I mean, Nagarjuna did say that studying emptiness is a little bit like picking up a poisoned snake. But we live on this planet with poisoned snakes. So if you pick it up, you want to pick it up correctly. Mm. So it's the same with any philosophy. So for instance, we take Darwinism. It seems like a fairly innocuous philosophy. But of course, Hitler was just a pure Darwinist. I mean, he just took Darwin philosophy and said, well, if there's a, selection, natural selection is the process within humans, we also are subject to that, and therefore we can naturally select. His big mistake, of course, was thinking the Germans were the superior bunch and the Jews were inferior, because the Jews end up getting something like 28% of Nobel Prizes, and they're only 0.2% of the population. So they get like 300 times their fair share of Nobel Prizes in various schools. So, any philosophy comes up can be misinterpreted and used badly by any given individual. And if that individual is a king or a dictator, it can be a problem. So we see that in Christianity. I mean, the Spanish Inquisitions, in which 2 million people were burned at the stake, tortured to confess their pagan beliefs and so forth. That wasn't done out of maliciousness or hatred, but out of compassion. If they can be purified of their dark beliefs or their distorted beliefs, not accepting the one Christ before they die, if they can be purified of that, they will go to heaven. And if they can't, they'll go to hell for eternity. So this doctrine of compassion becomes a weapon of torture and murder. So anything can be misused by humans, and you'll always find some humans which will misuse anything. But I think there's no reason why humans can't accomplish anything that anyone else has ever accomplished. And of course, Westerners are closer to Indians than are Tibetans or Chinese or Mongolians.
Well, that brings me to my final question for you, and that is, if rainbow body or light body is, say, a byproduct or a side effect of enlightenment or vast realization, how come it only happens to some and not others? You'll have other great beings like Diego Khyentse Rinpoche, Kalu Rinpoche, the Dalai Lamas, the Karmapas. There's no cases of them dissolving into light or shrinking. So why some and not others?
I think it's got to do with the relationship of that Lama or that master with his or her disciples. So one aspect of enlightenment is that after enlightenment, your body becomes a kind of a magical substance. It becomes the relics of your body have a kind of magical power, you could say. And so a problem with the rainbow body is there's nothing left as relics. And so it's a little bit of a quandrum, you could say, conundrum. And so generally, monks and humble people are not allowed to manifest rainbow body because it's manifesting a certain kind of accomplishment in a very public way. So generally, the biggest miracle of the Dharma, of the Enlightenment tradition, is the miracle of teaching. In other words, a miracle of how one human being who accomplishes enlightenment can transmit the enlightenment technology to another. That's the real magic of enlightenment. whereas the nature of physicality is purely a materialistic statement, you could say. Generally, with the rainbow body, whether or not it manifests in the way that it's poetically described is another issue. We don't have any situation in which anyone has died in a clinical situation with observance by, say, physicists, physical scientists. And so we don't really know. So, for instance, with the Chatra Rinpoche in Parping, for instance, often his students say he achieved the rainbow body. And you can see how he sat up on his first day and his body gets smaller and smaller and smaller. But of course, my dad was 5'8" when he was, 25 years old. When he passed away, he had shrunk to like 4'11". Humans, as they get older, do shrink. Of course, when we die and we dehydrate, 2/3 of our body is liquid. So if we sit there in tukdam, our body is going to lose a lot of its status just by the natural dehydration process. So, for instance, the guru of one of my gurus, one of my lamas, said in his third 3-year retreat, there are 10 or 12 of them doing a retreat with their lama. And one day he said, I'm going into and the way Tibetans did hut retreat was often like a complex with a wall outside. Everyone had their own little quarter that they do practice in, and then there's a central place where they can gather to practice together and get the instruction, meet with the teacher, and a little central compound for getting some sun and whatnot, some vitamin D during the practice. And during halfway through the third 3-year retreat that he did, he said, their teacher said, well, I'm going into my hut for the next couple of weeks and into my little chamber, and nobody should disturb me. But after 5 days, they got a little suspicious about it and peeked in, and they noticed that he was sitting on his thing, and he was about half his normal size and was very radiant. And so then they all sort of went in and started meditating with him, and he just became sort of smaller and smaller. And then the hair and nails just sort of fell off. Hair and nails can't be rainbowized, or rarely are rainbowized. And then his body just became a little ball of light, and then at one point just went boom. So he told that story of his teacher. Now, that particular Lama was a little bit famous for tall tales, so there was no video camera running or science physicist keeping notes day by day. And these are all strongly devoted students. So it's hard to say, really. So I think when there has been such an event, it generally tends to be in a private retreat situation. And I don't think the rainbow body is so much referring to that as referring to how our physical body is in its coarse form. And when we're asleep, we have that same body. We see ourselves looking much the same with a few different characteristics. That's sort of our subtle body, you could say. And of course, when we do very deep Chandali or Tummo practice, and we have the ability to project the mind out of the body, to separate mind and body altogether. That's an even more subtle form of embodiment. So we could say those are the three levels of subtlety of our physicality, of our embodiment. And one is the embodiment based on our karma from our previous lives, which is this flesh and bone and five senses. And the other is our very subtle winds or energies that drive inside, that become our dream body at night. And the third, when we leave this body at time of death and enter the bardo, that sense of physicality we have, or if we do it by separating body and mind during very deep meditation, doing out-of-body meditation practice. So it's that out-of-body meditation practice, which is really the nature of the rainbow body. It's just, we have that at all times, but our ability to connect with it is just not there. It's like dogs can smell things that humans can't. And some species can see in the dark and we can't, and so on. So the ability to perceive those more subtle levels of experience really come when we are able to relax the prison of conceptuality and go to a more subtle level of consciousness. Therefore, it's always said in every Tantric tumult tradition, Chandali, Kundalini tradition, that we've got three levels of body, this coarse one from which arises coarse mind. And it takes 3 eons of millions of lifetimes to accomplish enlightenment on that basis. And the subtle body, which is the inner energies and winds and drops, the inner chemistry, you could say. And if we can sedate the five senses and the coarse body in meditation, and meditate solely on the basis of the subtle body, one day of meditation becomes 100 years. And so then, rather than achieve enlightenment in 3 countless eons of some hundreds of thousands or millions of lifetimes, we can do it in 1, 3, or 16 lifetimes. And if, on the other hand, we can go even beyond that, and go beyond subtle body to most subtle body, which is really just the wind driving, supporting our karmic seeds of previous lifetime experiences, and separate the subtle energies, our DNA, you could say, the input from our DNA and our subtle chemistry. Then enlightenment in instant enlightenment becomes a possibility. And it's that third level that the rainbow body is, in my opinion, really talking about the energy level of that third side. And the person who dies consciously engages in tukdam and is able to hold the clear light at the mind without that body chemistry, without the movement of the bodies, and without the coarse body or subtle body, is purely on the level of most subtle body, most subtle mind. Rest in clear light, the body takes on a special radiance and, of course, shrinks from dehydration as it sits there for days, weeks, months. I mean, one of the Panchen Lamas even sat for 6 months like that. And he was a real pipsqueak by the time they embalmed him. I mean, there wasn't a drop of moisture left in his body. And most lamas, all my lamas who've died, who passed away, engaged in that tukdam practice of conscious death and letting the coarse body just stop altogether, and the chemistry therefore traveling in the blood and whatnot also stop, and meditating on the basis purely of the most subtle level of physicality and the most subtle level of mind. And you could say that's a kind of a rainbow manifestation. And I think we see that with Dilgo Khyentse Rinpoche and Nyingmapas and Desheng Rinpoche of the Sakyas, my own guru, Kyabje Ling Dorje Chung of the Gelugpas, and every school has had, in the last generation or two, has had not only one or two, but some dozens. Like Gelugpa, I would say we have probably 100 lamas who manifested that power during the time of my training, including, I would say, 25 of my own teachers. I noticed in your paper you mentioned something about Christ and the rainbow body after the resurrection. And of course, in my opinion, Christ did travel in India between ages 16 and 28, those years when his biography totally is expurged from Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, those apostles who are dead and gone. And certainly learned these traditions. If we look at the difference between Christianity and Judaism, you can really see it is a smudge of the Buddhist traditions of India. And of course, at that time, India was officially throughout a Buddhist nation. I mean, Ashoka had made it that, and the official Buddhist stamp of approval was there on the entirety of the subcontinent, coming up through Pakistan and into Khotan and Afghanistan and all that. So it's possible, certainly, but that Christ would have that even from a Buddhist tradition. But these are universals, so it doesn't require an historical connection, I think, for that process to be accomplished. I think in ancient times, we see it in many, many civilizations. And let's hope that we in the West will be able to manifest for the next 2,500 years, because Buddha said that 2,500 years after my passing, my Dharma will go to the land of the red people, which, as Dalai Lama said, means the European-based peoples in Europe and America. And of course, that year was 1956. And in 1956, Prime Minister Nehru in India called a meeting of Buddhist masters from all over the world that traveled to India. And that was the first time that all of the Tibetan great masters met with all of the Mongol great masters, met with all of the Chinese great masters, met with all of the Japanese and the Thai and so on. And from that time on, when they went to India in that time, Bodh Gaya was really just a little grease spot in the middle of the semi-desert of Bihar. And now it's sort of turned into a kind of a Mecca, you could say, or an Orlando of theme parks, Buddhist theme parks from different world traditions. So, at that time, 1956, there was not a single Tantric Buddhist center in the West or in Europe or in America. And now there's over 1,000 in both, just 65, 70 years later. It's kind of a remarkable transfer of wisdom, knowledge, mysticism. And it's very exciting to be alive during that period if you like mysticism and enlightenment.
Thank you so much, Lama. Is there any final last thoughts? Anything else you would like to share in closing?
Well, I think the main message coming through the masters of all schools of Tibetan Buddhism is that the Dharma is like a cushion. And if you grab a cushion and pull on it, it doesn't matter which part of it you get. A grip, that you grip, when you pull, the entire cushion moves. So people who engage in some level of the Enlightenment tradition coming through Thailand or Burma or China, Japan, Korea, Tibet, Mongolia, and so forth, when we grab one little thing, we get a little bit of a shift of all things. And as we've seen, enlightenment has been achieved wherever the Enlightenment tradition has gone. So we as Westerners should be fully confident that whatever was accomplished by a Dalai Lama or a Panchen Lama or a Dyogo Khyentse or a Karmapa, in a way, we should be able to accomplish that even more easily than they did, because we have them as precedents. I remember once when I was talking with one of my lamas, and it was on the subject of 6 yogas of Naropa, and someone asked the question, today, can people still achieve enlightenment? Milarepa achieved enlightenment in one lifetime. What do you think today? He said, well, it should be even more easy today than for Milarepa, because we've got Milarepa as one of our tools as well, whereas he did not have that. So we have this much bigger toolbox, if you will. He didn't use the word toolbox, but treasury, I think was the word he used. And so people should feel that whatever Lao Tse accomplished, we can accomplish. Whatever Rumi accomplished, we can accomplish. Whatever a Buddha accomplished, we can accomplish. I think a problem we do have in the Tibetan world is Tibetans are mostly refugees. And so there's a little bit of a kind of Tibetanization of the tradition within the Tibetan Dharma community. So a lot of centers around the world just keep bringing over Tibetan monks to teach in their centers rather than produce their own teachers. I think this is a bit of an obstacle and it's tied to a number of facets, but mostly I think it's tied to the refugee syndrome. These Dharma centers in the West support those monasteries and training things in the refugee communities in India and Nepal and elsewhere. And I think we have to go beyond that. Of course, it's important people support those facilities. And I don't want to be critical of Tibetans for operating their Dharma centers as kind of fundraisers for their institutes in which they were trained in India and Nepal. But eventually, Dharma in the West has to go beyond that. And I think because it's continuing like that, there's kind of a sense that a Tibetan teacher has an advantage over a Western teacher. A Tibetan has an advantage over a Western practitioner. You know, I used to bring over groups of Tibetan monks and to do sacred music, sacred dance. And Western people would look at these kids who had been monks for 3 or 4 years and knew next to nothing. Before they became monks, they basically wandered around behind sheep or goats in Tibet and then the Himalayas and look upon them like they were complete saints. And the ladies would give them big hugs, and if the guy would panic and grab them by the butt or by the breast, they'd be like totally shocked, like, I thought these guys were saints. But the reality is, there is something very charming about racism and about admiration of specific races. And when we see it in Kung Fu movies with Chinese Kung Fuists and in Japanese karate movies and so on and so forth. But that kind of racism does help us admire foreign races. But on the other hand, for Enlightenment tradition to become fully Westernized, we have to go beyond the racist element. The holy Indian, the holy Tibetan, the holy Chinese Zen masters, and so on. And understand that everyone is equally holy and equally samsara, equal nirvana. They both have, everyone has a heart aspiring to goodness, but they also have the clashes of desire and anger and so forth, looking to triumph in samsara in some way and trying to find a balance between samsara and nirvana. So thank you very much for inviting me to the interview, and I hope something I said will be at least slightly useful.